Curso do professor, do Coronel Parnell. Serão 50 minutos, com um intervalo de 10 minutos, depois mais 50 minutos de apresentação, seguido do almoço. O Coronel Parnell falou que quem tiver alguma dúvida, alguma questão, não precisa esperar o final da apresentação, pode levantar o braço e fazer o questionamento, beleza? Professor, Coronel.
Okay, thank you.
You have your audience.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's great to be here and talk about an important topic of capabilities-based planning, and specifically talk about how we can use value-focused thinking with capabilities-based planning. So to give you an idea of the summary of the presentation, we're going to talk about different strategies that have been used for defense resource allocation in the post-war, since World War II. And during the Cold War, we'll talk specifically about what capabilities-based planning is intended to be and what it is, introduce value-focused thinking, and then talk about how value-focused thinking can be used both qualitatively and quantitatively to assess capabilities. And so that's where we're going. So what's your background on these topics? So if you have a background, maybe your background is project management, so I'm just going to go around and just tell me what your primary, just pick one. Okay, sir? What's your background in any of these topics? Not much. Okay. Strategic planning. Sir? Okay. Strategic planning. Okay. Strategic planning. Modeling and simulation. Good. Value-focused thinking. Great. Okay. Strategic planning. Scenario capability. Okay, great. Okay. Modeling and simulation. Okay. Lots of modeling and simulation. Okay, sir. Strategic. Okay. Scenario-based. Scenario. Great. Okay. Strategic planning?
Yeah, I couldn't follow up everything. So.
Okay, that's all right. Okay, let's just keep going. Yeah, next. Yep. Strategic planning? VFT? Good. Right. Okay. Great. Great. Okay, sir? Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, great. So you've got a wonderful background combined here for this, for the presentation. So just, and the other thing I'd like you to do is, this is more like a course than a lecture. So I don't have that awful many charts. So if you have questions, please ask, okay? And if it's, I'm going to cover it later, we'll write it down, and then we'll get to it when the right time. Okay, so here's my background. I've had the opportunity to write 3 books. One's in its 3rd edition, and I've written the handbook and decision analysis that we used and talked about in the other one. And then more relevant to the work we're doing here is this book, which we put together with a large group of system engineers with all kinds of experience, modeling and simulation, planning, et cetera. And we go through the system life cycle and talk about how modeling and simulation can be used to do trade-offs, okay? Take you right through the life cycle from concept to operations, giving examples as you have more and more data. And I've been fortunate enough to publish a lot of research in several journals, national and international journals. Okay, so we're going to start with strategic planning, and we've got many strategic planning folks here that have great expertise in that, and then we'll go through the other ones. So basically, strategic planning relative to defense is focused on the following. You know, you're trying to figure out why. That starts with strategy. That starts with the national strategy and the national defense strategy. So that's the why. Then the what and the how is what technologies are available to you, what systems can you develop or purchase through foreign military sales, what technologies and systems are available. That's the what you have to figure out, and the how. And then it comes to the if and when. The if is if you are going to get funding. And then the when is, okay, if you got funding, how long is it going to take, right, to lay out your resource allocation plan, right? So it starts with strategy here, what your objectives and your policies are. And these are the organizations in the United States. Obviously, you have different organizations that do this, but still there has to be some organizations that provide that, right? But this is how it all ties together. It ties together with why you're doing it, what you can do, and how it'll be done, and then the resource allocation. So where do you think capabilities-based planning is going to fall? Let me grab my water. Where does capabilities-based planning come in? Well, I think it's over here. It starts with this, right? But it's about the what and the how, right? What capabilities do you need? And then evaluating the how it can be done, right? So assessing that. So capability-based planning is one of the techniques to do that. Okay, in the post-World War II, the United States went through at least 3 major approaches to planning. The first one was what we call the Cold War analysis, and that was primarily NATO versus the Warsaw Pact was the primary. So it's focused primarily in Central Europe. Now, that doesn't mean that we weren't interested in other areas and got involved in conflicts in other areas, Vietnam for one, during that time frame. But the primary focus of planning, strategy, and capabilities was there. Then, with the fall of the Soviet Union, and the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1989, they needed a new construct for determining the force size. And in the United States, we had what we called the peace dividend. You ever heard of the peace dividend? So the peace dividend was how much can we not spend on defense now with the fall of the Soviet Union. So the leadership at the time came up with the idea of major regional conflicts as a basis for force sizing. And I'll talk about that. And then that lasted for a few years, but there really wasn't enough there. It wasn't enough detail to make intelligent decisions. And then an individual at RAND, which is a think tank in California, came up with the idea, Paul Davis came up with the idea of capabilities-based planning. And we've gone through some iteration of that, but that's been the primary thing that we've used in the United States is capability-based planning. Okay, the Cold War scenario analysis, we could look at force structures, all kinds, you know, air, land, sea, force structures. And then it was useful for assessing capabilities and existing capabilities and new capabilities. Now, to do that, we required a scenario, and we required to have knowledge of the intent and capabilities of the adversary. So those of you who do modeling and simulation, you have to have two things. You have to have knowledge of your own capabilities, and then you have to have knowledge of the adversary's capabilities, and you have to have some idea of what the adversary is going to do, and then you can figure out your best strategy with modeling and simulation, right? That's what we do with modeling and simulation. But you have to be able to, it starts with information about capabilities and intent. Now, if you listen to my presentation yesterday, you know that capabilities intent is uncertain information. And we've got problems, and it's challenging to deal with uncertain information, right? And we can overestimate capabilities, or we could underestimate them, and we can overestimate intent or underestimate intent, right? So we've still got to deal with cognitive biases and decision traps in this, right? And quite frankly, in the United States military, every single service overestimated the Russian capability demonstrated in Ukraine, without a doubt. Overestimated their capability. So this means for years, that would be the case. Now, I remember in the Iraq War, another example. In the Iraq War, we did our modeling and simulation before the air war started. And we predicted that there would be, I don't know, maybe a 3% attrition of aircraft. 3 to 5% is what the models and simulations. And if you followed the air war, the percentage attrition was 0. Okay? And that was helped by some of the pilots went the other way, right? But so when you combine capabilities, training, leadership, all these things matter in military capability. And it's hard to combine them all in models and simulations. So sometimes we overestimate capabilities of an adversary. Okay, the United States structures their defense forces around what we call combatant commands, and their regional commands. And we've had this structure for a long time. We adjust it periodically, but that's the primary focus we do. So when of course, our focus was right here during the Cold War, and then the focus opened up when we went after the fall of Russia in 1989. So then the question is, what do you use for sizing the force structure, given you don't have the Soviet Union as it existed before? So the approach that was selected initially was called major regional contingencies, okay? And now that created a debate because you had to figure out how many major regional contingencies at one time and how many would be needed. Your minor contingencies could be done at the same time. And then you had to deal with the realities of a force structure. So one of the ways that we worked around that, and that was about the time that I was in the Pentagon, we were doing this, is we worked around, we did not have the airlift capacity for 2 major regional contingencies at that time. Okay, so how did we solve that? Well, we said the second regional contingency would occur after we airlifted the forces to the first one. That's a pretty convenient solution, right? And so that's how we did it, right? So we could do 2, but airlift was a constraint, so we had to get the forces there with air and sea lift, and then we could switch over to another major regional contingency with that, right? So, I mean, there were some subtleties that had to be dealt with in this framework here. And then we could, after use models and simulations, now we had to get very scenario specific. And as opposed to one scenario that we've been working on for decades, right, now we had to come up with a bunch of other scenarios for these different regions, right? So that took some work and effort. So I led an analytical organization, and it took 1 year for us to update our models, simulations, and data to run those models, to switch from the Soviet Union to these major regional contingencies. 1 year it took to switch all the data on it, update new scenarios, get new planning factors for every weapon system, and a new set of adversaries and all their capabilities, right? So it's not an easy thing to do on a grand scale. And then it still required scenarios, but they were a very much more diverse set of scenarios than the European scenario that we've been using for years and years, right? So now we needed scenarios for North Korea, scenarios for other places, right? So that took a lot of effort. But in the end, that became pretty burdensome to do, and it wasn't as politically palatable to release what the scenarios were, right? So we classified the scenarios so they wouldn't be released. We call them the scenarios defense planning guidance, which is usually kept classified. So to handle that issue and to get a more transparent approach to capabilities planning, Paul Davis, who is one of the smartest people I know, and I'm happy to call him a friend, and he came up with this idea of capabilities-based planning. Paul's also been involved in several other defense issues, including effects-based operations and a variety of things. And he wrote his first book here, Analytic Architecture for Capabilities-Based Planning, Mission System Analysis and Transformation. And it was focused on transformation because they were trying to transform the services from a focus on Russia to a focus more internationally, to threats internationally, and including terrorism threats too. So he did that, but it turned out to be very hard to do across the whole defense structure, right? Remember I told you just to adjust to 2 new contingencies required a year. So it took a lot of time, and there was a lot of complexity in figuring out, and you'll see when we get to the questions, it's not easy. So it was a great idea, but hard to implement in a bureaucracy where each service is fighting for its own force structure. Now, I know that wouldn't happen here in Brazil, right? But in the United States, we have each of the services articulates very strongly for their own, put on the blinders. I'm Air Force, I love Air Force, right? I'm Army, I love Army, so I want Army. So it's a challenge, right? So the idea, and then you're focused on very much like the opening presentation on combined operations. We call them joint operations, but you've got to combine the capability of the services when they have incompatible communication systems, incompatible systems that don't play well with each other. So Capabilities-based planning was an attempt to get at that too, right? To get at, let's look at the capabilities across the services, right? To make sure we have the right capabilities and they're integrated together, and they can work together. So that was the idea. So capabilities-based planning started out in services, but it was really got its benefit here when you went to the joint or defense community and looked across the services at capabilities. So the theory was that Paul advocated is you look across your capabilities of all the services and you identify critical missions and gaps. Now, what's a gap? A gap is something that you're not able to do now. Not able to do now. And so the idea was you could identify those gaps and then use those gaps to look for new programs, upgrades, new systems to fill those gaps. That was is everybody clear? The central focus of capability-based planning? Okay, so that's the central idea. So let's go to the next one. Oops. Okay, so what is capabilities-based planning in more detail? So what Paul suggested is you start first with missions. What are the missions that have to be accomplished? So notice that missions are in his context, are joint missions. You can certainly look at it with one service, but he's preferring to look at it for joint missions, combined missions. And then you figure out what your objectives are, and then once you have your objectives, then you go to the measures and metrics to quantify those objectives. Why? Well, because we need that data to prove to Congress that we need the funding, right? We just can't say, we'd really like to have this, right? We've got to say, here's our objective, and here's the metric we're not able to do today, and we could do if you fund this system, right? So that's the linkage here. Now, the next thing you do is you find capability set options. Now notice he's putting all the things together: forces, weapons, command and control, logistics, doctrine, plans, skills, training, all the components of military force effectiveness, right? Then you go to an analysis of the mission versus the capabilities. And you start out with, and you got to factor in uncertainties, right? So remember from the presentation on cognitive biases, if you have an uncertain variable and you pick one number, you have no idea what you're getting. No idea. Are you getting a worst case, a best case, an average? You don't know. So it's a better approach is to ask yourself, what's the range of uncertainty? And then I'm going to later show you there's a very common technique used in almost all corporations, including financial ones, called Monte Carlo simulation, where you can take any model and convert it from a deterministic model to a probabilistic model, okay? So that's a major part of what we're advocating here is dealing with uncertainty as opposed to picking one number. Okay, so that's why he says here the uncertainties. And then you do it with and without. And here, part of the way you can get the uncertainties is by looking at what he called the scenario space, or the range of scenarios, as opposed to one scenario. Look at a range of scenarios. And then finally, you would get to assessment of options and distinguish when these options would be effective. When would they make the most contribution? And then you can also assess the risk in any of the missions that you looked at, and then evaluate the feasibility, adaptiveness, and robustness, identify the value gaps. So that's what Paul Davis designed as the overall structure. Okay, now, we give that structure to a bureaucracy called the Department of Defense with a bunch of services, right? And the first question is, how do we identify the mission? Well, guess what? Every service in the United States has their own set of missions. And they don't have a common set. So DOD had to start work on a common set of missions so they could do the capabilities-based planning against a common set of missions. That took a lot of work and effort. That took a couple of years of effort to do that. Then within a mission, you have to look and ask yourself, what capabilities do we need to analyze? Do we need to analyze every single capability or just a few of them, the ones that we think we don't do well? So you got to take every mission and break it down into the capabilities that are required to achieve that mission. So that's work. And then you have to figure out how to identify, measure those capabilities. How do you measure those capabilities in a quantitative way? Because again, why do we need it quantitative? Well, we need to go to Congress and say, here's this capability, here's this mission, here's this capability, and here's the gap that we can't do, and therefore we need this system funded to fill that gap. Okay? And then we come to capability options. This turns out to be the easiest part of the problem. Why is that? Why is that the easiest part of the problem? Because we have the whole United States defense industry to help us. And if you can tell the defense industries what your problems are in the United States, I would guarantee you the defense industry will come up with systems, technologies to meet those needs, right? You may or may not be able to afford them, but they can come up with those. So you get a lot of help when you get to this stage from the defense industry, which is a good thing. Now, we need to identify these scenario gaps, right? So we have to look at the scenarios and look at the gaps in there and quantify those gaps, okay? And now we come, several people said they were modelers and simulators, right? And have modeling and simulation knowledge. Here's where they come in, right? So this is too complex to do in your head. These complex scenarios with forces coming from various directions, different systems involved, different adversary capabilities. So modeling and simulation is a way to work that, right? Work on that. So that's where we have to end. Now, all models and simulations are not equal, correct? Right? Some are low fidelity, meaning they're more aggregated, and some of them are higher fidelity, meaning they have more details in them, right? So you have to select. Now, the bad news is the high fidelity costs more and take more time, but the good news is they tend to be more accurate than lower fidelity models, okay? But sometimes we're forced to use low fidelity models to get started, and then as we get more focused, bring in a higher fidelity model. But that's where models and simulations come in right here, right? And sometimes we do not have a model to analyze the capability. So for example, when I was in the Pentagon, we did not have a model to analyze stealth capabilities on a campaign and assess the stealth capabilities. So it took a major modeling effort to be able to analyze stealth capabilities. So sometimes it takes effort for new technologies. And we have new tech, hypersonics. We have a whole bunch of new technologies enabled by a variety of technology. And then finally, where do we get the data to evaluate? Okay. And in the United States, if it's adversary data, we go to our intelligence community. And of course, we can also go, if it's air and space, to Jane's or some document, international data, which is you might use if you're doing unclassified. But in the real sense, we go to our intelligence community to get capability and intent data to use in this kind of analysis. Any questions on the role, capability-based planning, or the role of mission system analysis as Paul Davis envisioned it? Okay? All right. So let's switch now to value-focused thinking. So several folks said they had some knowledge of value-focused thinking, but not everyone. So I'm going to give a little bit more detail on value-focused thinking to bring us all up to the same level. And then I'm going to apply it to capabilities-based planning. Okay? Now, any questions before we go on to VFT? Okay? All right. Ralph Keeney wrote a book in 1992 called Value-Focused Thinking that has had a great impact on my personal research and the research I have done on defense and defense planning. In this book, he hypothesized two extremes way of thinking. The first one is Ralph called alternative focused thinking. And he says in alternative focused thinking, we start with a problem. And then we start our problem solving, focused on that unique problem. And then we start listing alternatives. And then we might specify evaluation criteria, and then come up then evaluate all the requirements or all the alternatives on the evaluation criteria, and then we would make a decision. Okay? That's alternative focused thinking. Value focused thinking is very different. In value focused thinking, you might start with a problem, or you might start with an opportunity. So in defense planning, if we started with an opportunity, we might say, gee, hypersonics technology is here already and will be available more commonly in the future. What missions can we use hypersonics technology on to achieve our national security objectives, right? That would be an opportunity. Here's a new technology coming, and how can we make use of that? Okay? Another opportunity could be access to commercial space systems. Suppose you wanted access to, or were able to get access to Starlink. What would that do for your capabilities? So we know, as was mentioned in the first presentation, that it made a tremendous difference to Ukraine, because their systems were taken out by the Russians on about day one or the first week. And if they had not had Starlink, they wouldn't have been able to command and control their forces, or for the president to be able to talk every night to his nation, right? So those capabilities can be civilian or military and new technologies. They're opportunities, right? So you can start with an opportunity. Then you go from there to your objectives. So notice that you don't focus right away on the alternatives. You go first to your objectives. What are you trying to achieve? Okay? And then after that, you develop creative alternatives. So you don't just take the alternatives that somebody gave you. You think hard about new alternatives. You talk to very smart people in all the areas that you're considering and try to come up with new or better alternatives. So, for you modeling and simulation experts out in the group, if you have 5 crummy alternatives, I would argue that the best models in simulation you have will only give you what? A crummy alternative. The best crummy alternative, but a crummy alternative, right? So what we want to do is we want to always be looking for great alternatives, better alternatives, right? Than just sometimes some we're struck with. Okay, and then we evaluate the alternatives. Now what the other contribution that Keeney made is you can use your objectives to directly measure and evaluate your alternatives. And that's a field called multiple objective decision analysis or multi-attribute utility theory or multi-attribute value theory. It goes by, or MCDA, it goes by different names. But you can basically use your objectives and quantification of measures of those objectives to evaluate your alternatives. And then we create better alternatives. As we look at the analysis, we're not done. We say, can we combine some of these ideas? Can we put this technology with this technology and this technology together and create a better idea, right? And select the best alternative. Now, which approach aligns with capabilities-based planning? VFT, right? Well, guess what the Department of Defense tried to do with capabilities-based planning? They tried at first to try it with alternatives, right? As opposed to thinking more outside the box the way it was envisioned by Rand when he wrote the report, right? That you rethink these. You know, they just tried to brute force it, take the missions they had, take the alternatives they had, and execute, right? But that wasn't what was intended by capabilities-based planning. So value-focused thinking aligns very well with capabilities-based planning. Okay, good. Okay, so in the second major paper that Paul Davis wrote, and what Paul attempted to do, and I've had discussions with him on this, is he attempted to clarify the things that weren't as well understood in the first book and the first approach, and to try to overcome some of the bureaucratic challenges and inertia and get people to think more creatively. So he wrote his second major book on this. And in that, he looked at a broad range of analytic instruments that could be applied to the capability-based planning. And as he did that, he assessed them on a scale of 1 to 5. Now, these are Paul Davis's assessment, but Paul has been doing this for a long time, right? And he has access to expertise in all these areas. So we might disagree here and there with him, but I think overall he's got a pretty reasonable assessment here. But you can look at that and you may have a different one. But what you have to conclude, the assessment here is done as like 5 is really good, green, that's very good, and 1 is very poor. And when you think of all the things you need here, these various things here, there's no one magic modeling and simulation technique that's going to fill the gap. Now that's probably not a surprise to most of you, but this is his assessment. It's my assessment for my professional career, look at a lot of modeling. So that means we're going to have to combine these different models and simulations creatively if we want to really assess a capability. Okay, so we're at a great point here to stop for our break. So we take 10 minutes, and we'll be back here and start in 10 minutes.